Prime Minister Justin Trudeau floated the idea of regulating news media and licenses, then quickly retreated. To talk more about this is Toronto journalist Brian Lilley. Brian, the PM received a lot of backlash, especially from the Conservatives, about trying to control the news. You know, what you and I do for a living.
Oh, absolutely. He was actually beaten up left and right over this. I mean, all sides were saying this is crazy. Now, it all started due to a report called, some call it the Yale Commission. That's after the last name of the woman that was heading up the commission. And it was on the future of broadcasting in Canada. And they said, you know what? We need to look at how CBC is funded. We need to look at how television stations like Bridge City News and Miracle Channel, how that's regulated. And we need to look at all of this. And by the way, while we're at it, let's start regulating online news media. That would include everything from a website that puts up news stories to podcasters. It was absolute insanity, Hal. It was a major power grab in this report. And then on one of the Sunday talk shows, Heritage Minister Stephen Guilbeault, who's came out of the Greenpeace movement, he's an environmental radical, one of the rising stars in the Trudeau cabinet, some might say. He's asked about it, and he's like, "Oh yeah, no, this sounds good. I agree with this, and here's how we'll do it." He didn't just say, "Well, we'll consider the report." He said, "Here's how we'll do it, and it'll be more stringent for bigger outlets, less stringent for smaller outlets." That was recorded on Friday, broadcast on Sunday, and by Monday morning, before 11 o'clock, he had completely recanted. Now, there's a couple of small things that make me worry. The Prime Minister, when asked about it in question period, said, well, we need to have credible news outlets. We need to have make sure that it's no misinformation. Look, during the election campaign, he referred to a report by Global Television that was about how DND was paying the provinces for our military personnel to get their health care. He described it as misinformation. By the end of the day, it was actually DND walking back and saying, yeah, we're not going to do it that way anymore. So Global was proven right. And of course, the Globe and Mail broke the story of the SNC Lavalin. And I was there. It was almost a year ago to the day. I'm there with Justin Trudeau as he says, the allegations in the Globe are false. Well, of course, we found out they were true and then some. So the Prime Minister is on record many times calling out major media organizations, reputable media organizations, as misinformation, as fake news. Do we really want him deciding who gets a license and who doesn't based on how he feels about them? I don't think so.
The Prime Minister was still defending giving Mastercard $50 million to help set up a cybersecurity center in Vancouver. Now, getting $50 million in corporate welfare, Brian, priceless?
Oh, priceless indeed. Look, Mastercard bought a company called New Data, a Canadian outfit that is, experienced in cybersecurity, and they bought them up because they said, okay, look, we need to be heavy into cybersecurity. And look, you want your credit card company to be big into cybersecurity. So they buy this Canadian company, and then they say, we're going to invest $510 million into a new cybersecurity office in Vancouver. Well, while they're in Davos, Switzerland, at the World Economic Forum, nothing says helping the middle class quite like going to the World Economic Forum in Davos, where the millionaires and billionaires gather to talk about how we should run the whole world, and offering Mastercard, a company that earned $16 billion last year, $50 million. $50 million is a rounding error to them. They're not going to notice it any more than if you don't pay your full bill, Hal. So why are we giving them the money? When asked, Justin Trudeau just said, the middle class. That was his answer over and over again. I don't know if he thinks that Ajay Banga, the CEO of Mastercard, is middle class because he only earned $20 million last year and has a net worth of about $260 to $270 million, or if he, really believes that subsidizing jobs with the private sector is the way to build the middle class. I don't think it is. It didn't work when his dad was in office, and it won't work now.
Alberta Premier Jason Kenney, Ontario Premier Doug Ford, and Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe are headed to Washington. But before that, Brian, Kenney is trying to sell Alberta in Montreal.
Yeah, he's doing full media tours. So, he was meeting with the Montreal Gazette editorial board. He's meeting with TVA, which is it's the most watched news, TV news outlet in Quebec. So being on that, big move for Jason Kenney to be out there to get that kind of publicity. But it is part of him and the other premiers going down to Washington. That's the big part of Kenney's trip, and the rest of them. They're going down to try and sell Canada to the governors. The National Governors Association holds their winter meeting this coming weekend in Washington, D.C. And by the way, later this year in April, they're coming up to Canada. Not all of them, but probably at least a dozen to 24 governors are going to come to Toronto with their staff on an infrastructure fact-finding mission. This is all good because essentially what the premiers are trying to do is say, look, there's these Buy American provisions that kind of block some of our companies. Can we find a way around it? Can we work together? The Buy American provisions are federal. They're from the Trump administration or previously from the Obama administration. Doesn't seem to matter who's president. They always have these protectionist measures. And the premiers are trying to talk to the governors and say, is there a way around it? Can we help each other out? Because in many cases, the states and the provinces are each other's number one trading partners. So this is a good thing for premiers Kenney, Moe, Legault, Ford for sure, and I can't remember who else is going, but those are the big guys.
Canada sent a plane to China to repatriate more than 300 Canadians. They'll be quarantined at CFB Trenton for a couple of weeks. Canada remains fairly stable when it comes to the coronavirus, with only 3 confirmed cases. I think 2 in Toronto. The couple is now recovering at home, and 1 in Vancouver.
Yeah, and then there's 1 in London, and she was a young woman who had been to Wuhan and was looking after her parents. It came back, went to the University of Western Ontario, and kind of self-isolated pretty quickly because she said, I'm not feeling well. She had mild symptoms. So overall, both the gentleman in Vancouver, the woman in London, and the woman in Toronto, they've all been able to self-recover at home. Only the man in his 50s, the first case that we ever heard about in Canada, had to be hospitalized, but he's home now. So fairly mild outbreak in Canada. We're recovering, but I think smart move both from a public relations and a public health perspective from the federal government to say, look, we're going to bring home as many Canadians as we can on this flight. It's going to leave in the early hours of Thursday morning. That's Wuhan time. So we're talking, late Wednesday night, essentially. They're going to bring them home. They're going to go to CFB Trenton in Ontario. That's probably about an hour and a half east of Toronto. And then they're going to be quarantined there. There's an air cadet base that they're going to set them up at. And I'm having memories of my time as an Army cadet being out on those. Everyone's going to be given their own secure space and 14 days. You've got to be 14 days clear, and then you're allowed to go home.
Ipsos recently asked 1,000 Canadians about their views on the 4 candidates who are running for the Conservative leadership race. Now, Brian, Peter MacKay, Erin O'Toole, Marilyn Gladu, and Derek Sloan. Out of the 4, the majority said they would throw their support behind Peter MacKay. No surprise there, I guess.
Well, 40%. So 40% of those polled said, yeah, I'd consider voting Conservative if Peter MacKay was leading the party. You compare that to about 30% for both Erin O'Toole and Marilyn Gladu, about 29%, I believe is the number for Derek Sloan. Obviously, it puts Peter MacKay as the front runner if you follow the idea that I've heard espoused by many Conservatives. I'm looking for the most right-leaning candidate who can win. And if that's what your basis for voting is, then you're going to be looking at Peter MacKay much more closely than the others. He's had some hiccups. He's had some ups and downs over the past little while, but he does remain the front runner, and the rest are trying to scrape by, look for oxygen, look for ways to get in. There are some other smaller candidates trying to climb into the race, and hitting that first threshold, we'll see if they break through.
Now, speaking of Mr. MacKay, he said he was not happy picking on Trudeau and his yoga recently when he sent out a tweet through his iPhone, I guess. Now, didn't MacKay say, while Trudeau does his yoga, I like to play hockey?
Yeah, so during my interview with him before he did his big launch, he made that remark because I asked him, I said straight up, look, people are saying, Peter MacKay is 54, Justin Trudeau's 48. That's not a big age gap between them. We were talking 6 years, and I said, people keep calling you yesterday's man compared to Justin Trudeau. And he said, look, people can judge me on my youthfulness. He does yoga. I play hockey. There was no nudge, nudge, wink, wink. Hey, he's effeminate, that sort of thing, which is how a lot of people took it. But after this tweet, a lot of people are saying Peter MacKay is trying to dog whistle to people and say yoga means that you're effeminate, and if you do yoga, you're not a real man, and he's a real man. So MacKay, getting some of that backlash, says, I'm not happy with the tweet. We'll see if his communications and his online team stay in place or if he does a shakeup in the middle of the campaign. I'm not sure he has to. He's still the front runner, but he may end up doing that. We shall see.
Apparently, when you perform yoga as well, you loosen up, limber up, and you play better hockey too. So maybe you should consider both.
This is what I've heard.
The former interim leader of the federal Conservatives, Rona Ambrose, is joining Liberal ministers, that's right, Liberals, to introduce a bill that looks similar to her legislation requiring judges to get training in sexual assault law. Brian, she says it is above anything political.
Yeah, so this is called Bill C5. So it's a government bill this time, but it is very similar. Not exactly the same, but very similar to a private member's bill that Rona Ambrose tabled when she was interim Conservative leader. And she said, look, we have a horrible track record of actually prosecuting people successfully when it comes to sexual assault. One of the problems is that, in her view, is that judges aren't properly trained in sexual assault law. So she wanted to look at this. She wanted to examine it. She wanted to make sure they all had training. The bill didn't pass all the way through Parliament before the election back in October. So the government said, you know what, we're going to take this up. My guess is how this is going to pass with multi-party support. I don't expect a lot of pushback on this. Maybe there'll be some tweaking on small issues, but I think overall this is going to get wide support from the parties.
All united, absolutely. Brian, the Parliamentary Budget Office says Canadians will get back more than they pay when it comes to the carbon tax. Now, haven't we heard this song and dance before?
Yeah, well, they say they'll get back more than they pay, but not as much as the government claims. And part of that is something that I pointed out, which is that, well, depending on where you live, you're going to be paying the GST or the HST. So you're in Alberta. You don't have a provincial sales tax. So you're looking at a 5% GST that will be applied on top of the carbon tax. So, take the carbon tax, add 5%. That's going to reduce what the government says you will get back because there's no way around paying that tax. Here in Ontario, it's 5% federal sales tax, 8% provincial sales tax, so that's 13%. And of course, in other provinces, it goes up and down depending on where you live. So the PBO said it's not going to be as much as the government claims, but they'll still get back more. Now, I still look at this and I say I don't buy it because both the PBO and the government numbers look at averages. And so, look, I live in downtown Toronto. I no longer own a car. I used to have a car. I drove quite a bit. Now I'm in downtown. I walk everywhere. I take the subway. Guess what? I'm not spending a lot on gas, Hal. So, but I'm still worked into the average. If you live in your average Canadian suburb, you are driving an awful lot of places. You're putting a lot of gas into the tank. Well, you take my zero and you're a lot and, find an average on them, it starts to say, well, you're going to pay a lot more than I am. And that's part of the problem with the way the government has devised this tax. So if you're your average suburban Canadian, you're still going to be paying more than what the government claims. You're going to be paying more than you will ever get back.
Here's a nice little story. A World War II veteran, Fred Arsenault, who turns 100 years of age on March 6th, wants to receive 100 birthday cards before he becomes the big 100, Brian.
Yeah, so he turns 100 on March the 6th, and he was a private in the Second World War. He was part of the Italian campaign. He was in Normandy at various points and received letters from the home front while he was on the war front. He wants to get 100 cards. So this, I guess, went back to an American vet who was about to turn 100 last year and put out a similar call. He decided, hey, I like that idea. He's received retweets on this from Toronto Mayor John Tory, from Ontario Premier Doug Ford, from myself. And let's hope he gets it. He lives in this, still lives in this small, cute little post-war bungalow out in Scarborough in Toronto's East End. And he is looking forward to getting as many birthday cards as he can get when he turns 100. I can only recall my grandmother turning 100 about a dozen years ago. And it warmed her heart for all the well wishes that she got, which at that point, I was able to take all the way to Scotland. Greetings from Prime Minister Stephen Harper back then.
Wow. Toronto journalist and one of our regular contributors, Brian Lilley, thanks again for your time today.
Thank you, Hal.